August 8th, 1963, 3:03 in the morning. A railway signal glows red at Sears Crossing in Buckinghamshire, forcing the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train to stop in the darkness. Driver Jack Mills applies the brakes. His co-driver David Whitby climbs down to check the signal. Within seconds, he's ambushed, thrown down the embankment, and restrained. Back in the cab, Mills turns just as a masked figure appears behind him. A metal bar strikes his head. He falls, bleeding profusely. 15 minutes later, it's over. 15 men disappear into the night with 120 mail sacks containing £2,600,000, worth over $60 million in today's money. No gunfire, no car chase, just meticulous planning, inside information, and 15 minutes that would stop Britain in its tracks. This wasn't a bank heist or an armored car robbery. This was an attack on the Royal Mail, a British institution as sacred as the crown itself. And the audacity of it, the precision, the sheer scale of the theft, transformed it from a crime into a legend. The newspapers called it the crime of the century. Scotland Yard launched the largest manhunt in British history. But as detectives closed in on the gang at a remote farmhouse, they discovered something that would haunt the investigation for decades. The money, nearly all of it, had vanished. Where did £2.6 million go? How did 15 criminals pull off Britain's most daring heist? And why, more than 60 years later, does less than £400,000 of the stolen fortune remain accounted for? This is the story of the Great Train Robbery, a story of inside men and outside jobs, of fingerprints on a monopoly board, of fugitives who became folk heroes, and of missing millions that may still be hidden somewhere in the shadows of British criminal history. The idea began, as many criminal enterprises do, in a pub. But this wasn't a drunken fantasy scrawled on a napkin. This was months of careful observation, intelligence gathering, and recruitment of precisely the right specialists for an operation that had never been attempted before in Britain. Bruce Reynolds was the architect. Born in 1931 in London, Reynolds had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison for burglary and theft. But by 1963, he'd graduated to bigger ambitions. He'd assembled a crew from South London's criminal underground, men who specialized in different aspects of robbery. Gordon Goody, who many regarded as the mastermind of the planning. Buster Edwards, expert in getaway logistics. Charlie Wilson, known for his nerve under pressure. Roy James, a racing driver who could handle vehicles at high speed. But the real breakthrough came through a man they called the Ulsterman. His true identity remained a mystery for decades. In 2014, gang member Douglas Goody finally revealed him as Patrick McKenna, a 43-year-old postal worker from Salford. McKenna possessed something invaluable: inside information. He knew the train schedules, the security protocols, and most importantly, he knew about a vulnerability that would make the entire operation possible. The traveling post office trains, known as TPOS, carried mail and high-value packages between cities, while postal workers sorted it in transit. The second carriage from the engine was designated for high-value packages, mostly cash being transported between banks. Normally, this carriage would hold around £300,000. But McKenna knew something crucial. The bank holiday weekend in Scotland meant consumer demand had created a massive flow of currency. On the night of August 8th, that carriage would be carrying between £2.5 and £3 million in used banknotes destined for destruction. Even better, the train's security was virtually non-existent. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch had recommended fitting alarms to all TPO carriages with high-value packages. By 1963, 3 such carriages had been equipped with alarms, bars over windows, and reinforced doors. On August 7th, all 3 of those secure carriages were out of service for repairs. The train would be using a reserve carriage with none of those protections. No alarm, no reinforced doors. Just a sealed door accessible only from inside, and 72 postal workers scattered throughout 12 carriages, most of them in the rear of the train, completely unaware of what the second carriage contained. The gang spent months preparing. They conducted the airport job at Heathrow in November 1962, stealing £62,500 from a BOAC payroll. It was practice. They needed to know they could work together under pressure. They rented Leatherslade Farm in Oakley, Buckinghamshire, as a hideout, 30 minutes from the target location, close enough to reach quickly, remote enough to avoid suspicion. They stockpiled food for weeks of lying low after the robbery. They acquired vehicles, Land Rovers for the rough terrain near the railway, a military truck for the heavy sacks of cash. And they recruited a retired train driver through Ronnie Biggs, whose sole job in the robbery was to bring this man aboard. They called him Pop, or Stan Agate. His real identity has never been confirmed. His role was simple. After they stopped the train, he would drive it to the optimal unloading point. On August 7th, 1963, at 6:50 in the evening, the Up Special Mail train departed Glasgow Central Station, bound for London Euston. Aboard were 72 postal workers and £2.6 million. None of them knew that 15 men were already in position, waiting in the darkness at Bridego Railway Bridge. The signal at Sears Crossing was supposed to be green. It had been carefully tampered with. A glove covered the green light. A 6-volt battery powered the red signal. When Jack Mills saw it and brought the train to a halt, the robbery was already in motion. David Whitby, Mills's co-driver, climbed down from the diesel engine to use the trackside telephone and report the signal failure. He found the phone lines cut. As he turned back toward the train, masked figures emerged from the darkness. He was grabbed, thrown down the steep embankment, and held there while the rest of the plane unfolded. In the engine cab, Jack Mills, 57 years old with decades of railway experience, heard movement behind him. He turned to see a masked man. Mills fought back. He was struck over the head with a metal bar, an attack so vicious that blood immediately began pouring from his skull. He fell, stunned and disoriented. The identity of the man who struck him has never been conclusively established, though it's believed to have been one of the gang's heavies, brought along specifically for muscle. That single act of violence would cast a shadow over the entire robbery and haunt the gang for the rest of their lives. With Mills incapacitated, the gang moved to the next phase. They uncoupled the rear 10 carriages, leaving only the engine and first 2 carriages attached. The 70 postal workers in the back of the train heard steam escaping and saw the coupling separate, but assumed it was a mechanical failure. They pulled the communication cord. They shouted out the windows. No one heard. No one came. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. Then came the first major problem. The retired train driver, Pop, climbed into the cab and immediately realized he'd made a catastrophic error. He'd spent years driving small diesel shunters on local lines. This was a massive English Electric Type 4 diesel-electric locomotive, far more complex than anything he'd ever operated. He couldn't drive it. With no alternative and the clock ticking, the gang forced Jack Mills, bleeding and barely conscious, to drive the train half a mile up the track to Bridego Bridge, where the rest of the gang waited with vehicles. Mills, in shock and pain, somehow managed to move the locomotive to the designated spot marked by a white sheet stretched between poles. At Bridego Bridge, the assault on the high-value package carriage began. Inside, 5 postal workers, Frank Dewhurst, Leslie Penn, Joseph Ware, John O'Connor, and Thomas Penn, heard the windows being smashed. Masked men poured through, overwhelming them with speed and numbers. The workers were restrained, ordered to lie face down, and told not to move for 30 minutes or they'd be killed. None of them resisted. None were armed. They were postal workers, not security guards. The gang formed a human chain from the carriage to the vehicles waiting below. 120 mail sacks, each weighing roughly 40 pounds, were passed hand to hand down the embankment. 2.5 tons of cash, banknotes in denominations of 1, 5, and 10 pounds. Most of them used bills with no recorded serial numbers. Untraceable, unstoppable. 15 minutes after the train stopped, the gang was gone. They left behind Jack Mills, still bleeding in the engine cab. They left behind David Whitby, shaken and traumatized on the embankment. They left behind 5 postal workers locked in the high-value package carriage, and 70 more still trapped in the uncoupled rear carriages. By 4:15 in the morning, the alarm had finally reached authorities. The gang was already at Leatherslade Farm, counting their fortune. They divided the money into 16 equal shares, approximately £150,000 each, plus smaller amounts set aside for associates. And then they did something that would prove to be their downfall. They celebrated. They played Monopoly with real stolen cash. They left fingerprints everywhere, and they forgot to cover their tracks. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper of Scotland Yard's flying squad took command of what would become the largest criminal investigation in British history. The newspapers were calling it the Great Train Robbery before the sun came up on August 8th. The audacity of the crime, the massive sum stolen, the precision of the planning, all of it captured the public imagination. Britain was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. The insurance companies and banks immediately posted a £260,000 reward, nearly $6.5 million in today's currency, for information leading to arrests and recovery of the money. It was an unprecedented sum, and it worked. Tips flooded in. But the real break came from a local resident near Leatherslade Farm. John Maris had noticed suspicious activity at the neighboring property. The new occupants had paid £100 over the asking price. They'd blacked out all the windows. They didn't seem to do any work. After the robbery, multiple vehicles appeared in the yard, including a lorry. Maris called the police twice. On August 13th, 5 days after the robbery, Police Constable John Woolley responded and found the hideout. The scene was extraordinary. Half-finished meals sat on the kitchen table. Sleeping bags and bedding filled upstairs rooms. In the cellar, banknote wrappers bore the stamp National Provincial Bank, one of the institutions whose money had been on the train. Empty mail sacks with distinctive red high-value package labels were scattered everywhere. And most damning of all, fingerprints covered surfaces throughout the farmhouse. The gang had hired 6 men to burn down the farm after they left, destroying all evidence. Those men did such a poor job that police essentially walked into a perfectly preserved crime scene. Fingerprints were found on a Monopoly board, on a ketchup bottle, on railings and door handles and glasses. the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The arrests came quickly. Roger Cordrey and William Bowl were caught within 6 days, with £141,000 recovered. Leonard Field, who'd purchased the farmhouse as the hideout, was arrested attempting to board a ship out of the country. Brian Field, no relation to Leonard, was caught after holdalls containing £100,000 with his fingerprints were found in woods near Dorking. One by one, the gang members fell. Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welch, Roy James, Buster Edwards, and Ronnie Biggs, whose only role had been recruiting the train driver. By early 1964, 12 members of the gang were on trial. The prosecution's case was built on forensic evidence from Leatherslade Farm and witness testimony from the postal workers. The defense tried to argue that presence at the farm didn't prove involvement in the robbery. Juries didn't buy it. The sentences were harsh, shockingly so to many observers. 30 years for the core gang members, a sentence typically reserved for violent crimes like murder. The judge wanted to send a message. Attacking the Royal Mail, attacking British institutions, would not be tolerated. But even as the convictions came down, the most important question remained unanswered. Where was the money? Of £2,600,000 stolen, police had recovered roughly £343,000 by the start of the trial. Over £2 million had simply vanished. Detective Superintendent Frank Williams believed he knew the answer. The money had been seized by predatory gangsters, greedy associates, relatives, and lawyers. It had been laundered through bookmakers who bought bundles of used notes at a discount. It had been smuggled abroad. It had been spent on cars, houses, bribes, and lavish living in the immediate aftermath. When Britain switched to decimal currency in 1971, most of the remaining stolen notes became worthless, no longer legal tender. The gang's dream of living comfortably on their ill-gotten gains evaporated almost immediately. Few of them ever truly profited, but some never stopped running. Charlie Wilson escaped from prison in 1964, freed by a 3-man team in under 3 minutes. He lived in Canada and Spain before being shot and killed in Marbella in 1990. Ronnie Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison in 1965 using a ladder dropped over the wall. He fled to Brazil, where he lived openly for 36 years, selling T-shirts and recording with the Sex Pistols, protected from extradition because he'd fathered a Brazilian child. He returned to Britain in 2001, seeking medical treatment, and died in December 2013 at age 84, just hours before a BBC drama about the robbery aired. Buster Edwards eventually returned to Britain voluntarily, served his sentence, and ran a flower stall at Waterloo Station. He took his own life in the 1990s. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, was finally captured in Torquay in 1968 after 5 years on the run. He served 10 years and died in 2013. Jack Mills, the train driver struck with the metal bar, never fully recovered. He returned to light duties, but the trauma stayed with him. He retired in 1967 and died in 1970 from leukemia. His family always insisted that the head injury contributed to his decline. David Whitby, only 25 at the time of the robbery, died of a heart attack in 1972 at age 34. Both men were victims as real as if they'd been shot. The final accounting of the Great Train Robbery remains incomplete. Less than £400,000 was ever recovered. Over half of that came from Roger Cordrey's share and Brian Field's alleged portion. £47,000 was found in a telephone box, part of a deal cut by Danny Pembroke. Small amounts were seized from individual gang members at the time of arrest. But more than £2 million, the vast majority of Britain's greatest cash robbery, has never been found. Some believe it's still out there, hidden in safe deposit boxes or buried in forgotten locations. Detective Frank Williams insisted that at least 3 men who were directly involved remain unidentified, living comfortably on their shares. The man who struck Jack Mills has never been conclusively named or charged. The Ulsterman's identity remained secret for 50 years. Pop, the train driver, was never caught and never suspected of even existing by police until years later. In 2025, more than 60 years after that August night, Leatherslade Farm still stands. Bridego Railway Bridge, where 120 mail sacks were loaded onto Land Rovers, has been informally renamed Mentmore Bridge by locals, though many still call it by its criminal alias. Train robberies of this scale have never been attempted again in Britain. Security changed, technology advanced, the age of the traveling post office ended, but the Great Train Robbery endures in British cultural memory, a crime so perfectly executed in its conception and so spectacularly bungled in its aftermath that it defies simple categorization. Was it brilliant or foolish? Daring or brutal? A victimless property crime or a violent assault that left 2 men dead within a decade? The answer, like the missing millions, remains somewhere in the shadows, forever just out of reach.